So yeah, I hate to be the introduced as being the last bastion there between you and your lunch, and I'm going to try and make this as interesting as possible. But let's a bit about me. So my name is Matthew Pendlebury, or Matt, or Matty, depending on whether you are my mother, or a colleague, or a client, or a friend. Happy to respond to all of those. I started off as a developer. I've worked in doing software development for about 17 years, managing software development processes, and then I jumped the fence and I now work with MWR Info Security, where I get to, well, play with security things, clearly, and I also try and push a lot of this back into my sort of passion for security back into development. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. So this is me hopefully talking to you guys about one of the most interesting ideas that's kind of come across my world for a little while. So let's start talking about attack-aware applications. How am I going to do it? So first off, what do I mean by attack-aware applications? There's a bit of confusion here, and I'll start to try and explain that through a few examples. Where's the idea originated from? A little bit of that. What's happening in the space? Where can we go with it? What might be happening? What might be developing on it? What can you do with it? Because I think there are things that you guys can do with it pretty much right now, or at least when you get back to your various offices and other places of work. And a couple of other future thoughts, which something just kind of cropped up, and I thought, oh, I wonder whether that fits in as well. So let's move straight on to what do I mean by attack-aware applications. So there's a bit of a problem with this. I'm known by many names, but you may call me, well, I like to call them lots of things. He's not Tim the Enchanter, but attack-aware applications is what I kind of decided to call the talk. I thought that was quite generic, and that kind of worked quite well. Clearly, a lot of different descriptions of things. I came up with the top one, but I realized that it doesn't have a very good business-appropriate acronym. I'll let you figure that out. Feel free to laugh. But basically, I think you might be starting to get the idea about what this might be, but I would describe it a little bit more as this. An application that can detect malicious behavior, whatever that might be, and respond to it in some way. And let's work through this with, let's work through this and see how it works out. If you get a chance as an application designer to be able to spot your attacker having a bit of a kind of a go at your application before they've managed to actively develop or an exploit a vulnerability, then maybe you get a chance to do something interesting with them, play with their minds. So this isn't saying this is a complete replacement for a secure development lifecycle or any of the DevSecOps models. I would say lay it on top. I'm also not claiming to have solved security. Clearly I have, but I'm not claiming to have solved security. Joke. But let's see. Why the application? What does the application know? So actually, I think your application knows quite a lot. You've probably got a big team, maybe you're part of that team, big team of people who've been thinking about what your application does. They put in a lot of hard work in to do with it. They have spent a long time thinking about how a user is going to interact with it, and thus they end up with a lot of knowledge about what normal looks like and what normal doesn't look like. So that basically adds up to context, because also your application has got a lot of information that may not be anywhere else in your organization at any one time. So that's why the application is quite interesting and quite and feels like quite appropriate at this point. So I'm going to work through some examples to try and communicate the sorts of things that I want to move on to. I'll start with credential stuffing. I'll explain what it is. I'm just going to say that this is intended to illustrate a point. I'm sure that some of you know a lot more about credential stuffing than I do. I thought that's a nice, good example for it. I can explain some points here. And then I started looking at it, and it's a rabbit hole, and it goes quite deep. It comes out in Australia somewhere. So we're not quite going to Australia, but I'm going to sort of start taking this down a little bit. So credential stuffing. So there's a slide from Troy Hunt of allegedly some live credentials that have been stolen from some breach elsewhere in the world, not your organization. They're out there, and this is a set of live credentials, username or email addresses and passwords in this particular case. What happens when this occurs in the real world? Basically, criminals, bad actors will get their hands on this information, and they're just going to start flinging this stuff at pretty much every web service that is out there in the world that uses email address and a password there to see if anybody has been foolish enough to reuse the same password. So if you have any service that you offer there, which it might be a web banking service, it might be some kind of loyalty card system, it might be retail, it could be anything. If you've got something out there, you're likely to get a lot of attacks like this. And that's 10 examples, but yeah, in reality, the list is going to be hundreds of thousands, depending on where it's been breached from. In the criminal ecosystem, what tends to happen is obviously that they get big lists like this, but actually any of those credentials that then happen to map to another service that you can log into, they become more valuable and they get kind of sold on. But we're not here to talk about criminal ecosystem. I'm here to talk about attack-aware applications. So what are we seeing here? You're seeing your login page being assailed by absolute volume, lots and lots of these attempts, maybe even coming from a single connection, a single session pushing these things. Yeah, I know that might be an assumption that may be incorrect, but we'll work with that for a minute. What do you do? Well, this is a naive approach. What do you do? Well, hello, I'm an application. I'm reporting that I have been subjected to credential stuffing from some IP address or some session, some detail. And you're pushing that up to your monitoring service, to your SOC, or other place where this stuff gets registered. At this point, you're saying, okay, well, what have we got here? We've got an application that's actually telling you what is happening, rather than you're just seeing an awful, at the SOC end, you're just seeing, trying to trigger a use case saying, how many password rejection accounts am I seeing? Am I seeing a bit of a spike in that? Am I seeing a traffic spike? No, what you're actually seeing here is you're getting, hopefully, a reasonably clear message saying, I am this application, which might be one of a lot, one of 100 applications if you're a large bank or something like that. One application is telling you what is happening, which says that that information is probably more valuable to your SOC or to your response services than you might otherwise get. The application isn't a little bit of thinking for it. So that's a start, but that's not necessarily about as good as it could get. What about, the application has done something about it. The application has said, I'm being assailed by this volume. I've now told the attacker that, very sorry, but the service happens to be unavailable for maintenance or whatever reasons, or I don't like you. It could be whatever it is. But actually, the application has taken a stance and is trying to do something actively about that. It may not be the most appropriate action because actually your attack is likely to come back. But as I say, I don't want to disappear too far down the credential stuffing rabbit hole because it's quite an interesting conversation and I don't have 3 hours because I'm between you and lunch. So what next? Well, what about this then? So now we're saying the application has spotted that this is going on. It's told the SOCs they can start to either monitor response or do something, but it has proactively said, hey, other network device, can you just make that IP address go away? Just go and drop the traffic or throttle it, stick it in a tar pit, do whatever you need to do to it. But actually it's now responded and it's asked a different device in your environment, which may or may not be appropriate, in order to do something with it. And it's told the SOC, and the SOC might go, that's great, but we don't need to do anything because the application has already kind of handled some of this. Okay, that's kind of cool. So I quite like that as an idea. Whether or not that would work in practice, I don't know. But it's still quite naive. So what else can we do about it? So, okay, let's take something else. Maybe the application wants to change its behavior in a slightly more sophisticated way. Maybe it's now saying something along the lines of, okay, I'm getting this credential stuffing attack kind of coming in, and what I'm actually going to do is anybody that's trying to log in through this and happens to have a correct set of credentials, because you've spotted it's a credential stuffing attack, and one of these credentials is actually right, but you know it's a credential stuffing attack, so it's an attacker, we don't want to let that attacker log in with, Mrs. Smith's credentials, do we? We actually want to say, no, don't do that. So maybe we want to do that by doing something such as, force an additional challenge on there, or something like that. Maybe that's what we want to do. So push a two-factor challenge, perhaps. But there's a slightly more sophisticated idea, which might be, actually, why don't we identify which of these credentials the attacker thinks are successful, and well, we know that they're successful because we actually have the list of credentials on our site, but we are going to proactively push all of those users that unfortunately have shared their passwords and the attacker has got hold of them because we know that we know it's the attacker, we're going to push them through a password reset journey, through a call center or other mechanism as appropriate. And hopefully, that's starting to do something very active there, which is defending your user base, even when they've basically done something a little bit silly. So that's kind of cool. The application, I would say, is probably the only thing that can realistically do it, because it's the only thing that's got access to that set of credentials and the knowledge there. I don't think you could do this if you used another technology, a web application firewall, or even the SOC wouldn't have visibility of this information. They're just probably going to see, for the most part, 200s and 500s and 404s and that sort of stuff. So probably not going to happen. Could a RASP do it? We'll talk about RASPs a little bit in a while, but I would also argue not. So, okay, so that's one sort of example of this. And actually, this sort of stuff happens a little bit in practice anyway, but let's move on to a different example. So, thinking of probably now an internal application, because it makes a little bit more sense. Think about the whole idea of honey values, honey pots, honey tokens, canaries, terminology. Where do we want to go with this? And think about something that shouldn't be touched or modified, because you've set a tripwire up. If anything goes over that tripwire, it's a burglar. Or if anything, if anybody kind of like touches the priceless portrait on the wall of the Louvre, then that's somebody trying to steal it. So you set off the alarms. You've made something that's really interesting and very tempting for an attacker, something that they can't resist. But what you've actually happened or caused to occur there is that the attacker is going to give themselves away to some degree. Something that a normal user is not going to look at and not touch. So the example there of putting a /admin page on your website, that's blatantly obvious. That's probably too obvious, to be honest, which is also why I'd say better as an internal thing. But maybe if you have a user ID or something like that, maybe it is actually the user ID of the user that is interacting with the site. That's fine. Why would you, as a usual, ordinary, everyday user, ever be modifying your own user ID by probably using a proxy and all the rest of it? You wouldn't do that. You know the session as the application. You know that this has changed. You are pretty darn sure at this point that that is an attacker. So straight away, that is a very high fidelity alert, and that is something that you can actively go and go and do some response on. So what do you do? Well, say you could tell your SOC. I would advocate doing this all the time. So you've got a central place whereby you can actually collate this information and kick off responses. You could start doing some things that are saying, all right, I've got this is definitely an attacker. Right, not interested in them, not going to talk to them, we'll drop their traffic, make them go away. Here's where it gets a bit more interesting. What if you were instead to say, okay, that's an attacker. I'm going to use some network routing to say, we're not talking, this attacker here was talking to my site, web application a moment ago, but right now, because I know it's an attacker, I'm just going to quietly redirect their session, their IP address, their connection in whatever way, somewhere else. What about a completely static copy of my site where they can't do any damage? Take a while to potter around that. There's no live data to steal. They may ultimately get a bit confused and wander off, one might hope. You could instead say, actually, we'll take that idea a bit further. What if you have a copy of our website in an identical environment, because it's kind of easy in cloud environments nowadays, isn't it? It's a bit of a separate copy of it, but we don't put any production data in it. Same code, but now you've only got an attacker in here, and if you instrument this thing, let's watch this attacker now trying to poke around on your website and break into it. Well, isn't that an interesting, useful information to say, right, we've figured out how somebody does this in exactly the same way that you kind of get this sort of value out of a bug bounty, perhaps, or maybe in some sort of pen testing thing. So you could also do something that's specific to your application. Clearly, I'm talking about the entire world of applications here. There is quite a lot of variety. It might be something very specific to your application. I don't know. So lots of ideas. Let's leave those fermenting in our brains. Let's talk about another way of doing things. I'm going to call it the sum of small suspicions. And again, this is kind of using a bit of a risk-based model. I know I have to say in my career, I tend to find that every time I speak to a developer and I mention the word risk, it kind of a visceral kind of shudder. I don't mean anything as scary as that. All I mean by it is to say, actually, let's have a bit of a think about this and say, what if it was, you're spotting things, what if you can identify somebody using a copy of Kali or likely to be using a copy of Kali with the right browser user agent and the right sort of underlying stuff, it's not even definitive. You can't guarantee that there are no legitimate users using, a kind of a pen testing Linux, for crying out loud, but it is a bit suspicious, yeah? It's a bit like wandering into a bank with a balaclava on. It's not necessarily definitely going to be bad, but it seems moderately likely. But what if you kind of think about a few other things that an attacker's probably going to do? Well, they're probably going to visit, look at they're going to be scoping out your website, they're going to be picking out all the different bits and pieces that go on in there. Oh, what are all the pages? Are there any interesting bits of functionality that I can find? Got to try all the doors, effectively. They'll be probably spidering the site in some capacity. If you start to spot that and go, somebody spidered the site, might be a very, very curious end user. I mean, they're even reading the T's and C's. Or actually, that's a bit suspicious. But it's not enough to say that's definite, but starting to pick some of that up. Then maybe you're also saying, well, actually, what do people do when they visit a web banking site? Well, they want to kind of log in, they want to look at their balance, they want to transfer some money, they want to set up a standing order. If that was banking, maybe they do these things. You've probably spent a lot of time thinking about your user journeys. So actually, you have a lot of that information already, and you might start to say, well, actually, there's not following not following these things. There are clearly about 1 million different things that you can pick up here and think, well, that's a bit unusual. I'll pop that into one side and think, well, that might be something that we could have a bit of a look at. So, have a bit of a think about that. An observation here, this makes a lot more sense when you have authenticated users as well, because you start to be able to kind of track them a little bit better, but that's just almost like an implementation detail. And also, thinking about it, think about kind of the reputation of the people kind of visiting the site. This one's a bit suspicious. They were a bit suspicious last week. They're a bit suspicious today as well. We've still got kind of that reputation from last week. We're going to continue kind of thinking about that kind of profile a bit. So, a bit of that. Where does that take us to? So, let's take something else. What if you're looking at a slightly different level? Rather than looking at kind of traffic and the way that things are used, let's look at some of your internal functionality here. So, assume this very naive web banking application. Very simple sorts of functionality you want to think about, which might be, viewing your account and transferring money to somebody else. Let's take a really simplistic example. You're logged in as Alice. It's strange having an audience that's all of whom are called Alice, but you're all logged in as Alice. And an internal function is called which says, I want to transfer money from an account to another account. That internal function is called saying, I want to transfer money from Bob's account to Mallory's account. Hang on a sec. Neither of these people are Alice. That seems very, very weird. It should be, you should be logged in as Bob to transfer money from Bob's account, one might hope. I mean, that seems a bit curious in its own right. You don't necessarily know how that's happened, but straight away, your internal sanity check is going, whoa, that's a bit curious. So, straight away, that's behavior that's quite interesting. Which brings me on to a little bit as to, well, how would you write that? I mean, this is pseudocode, but just basically to say exactly that sort of thing. These sorts of actions and behaviors are written as code. If it doesn't seem to make any sense, flag that alert and do something about it. Otherwise, do the normal thing, transfer the funds, which is fine. Yeah, you logged in as Alice here, you logged in as Bob or somebody else there. That's all that it is. And actually, in terms of writing applications, a lot of it is, this is the normal case, we sort of test for things, but actually if there's a case that doesn't seem to add up, let's flag that in some way anyway. So this is a simplistic example, absolutely. You may also find that this kind of, starting to get this kind of thinking will also flag logic bugs as well. You may find that there are sort of false alerts from those sorts of things. That's fine, but actually wouldn't you rather sort of spot some of this beforehand? So let's start talking about where this came from, because, well, I think all good stories need an origin story. So back in around 2010, this gentleman here was bitten by a radioactive spider in a laboratory. He wasn't. That's a bit Marvel, isn't it? So this is a chap called Michael Coates. A lot of other people are involved in this, but I think of all the themes that I keep coming, his name just keeps on cropping up. He's obviously had quite a career. Director of Security Assurance with Mozilla. He's been CISO of Twitter until fairly recently. He's also been global head of the OWASP board, or I don't know, somebody pretty senior in the OWASP organization. And he created an OWASP project called App Sensor. And I would suggest that's a bit of a passion project for him. He kind of he thought, and actually that's where a lot of these ideas came from, and that's where I picked up this idea. Now, I don't want to belittle everybody else's contribution in this field as well. His name keeps on cropping up. But I am aware of things such as, whilst he was at Mozilla, apparently they integrated some of these ideas into some of their internal applications, which is kind of cool. So it is happening around. There have been some academic papers as well, although they are, as academic papers are, quite dry and quite hard to consume, and often condemned to a life of academic papers. But moving on, let's take a bit of a look at App Sensor, which was the project that he formed. So easy to find on the net. What's distinctive about this? Well, it has what I'll call a reference implementation. You might call it proof of concept. I would argue that it's probably not production code. Your mileage may vary. It takes the idea a little bit more seriously, and it kind of pulls things apart a little bit. It has what's called a central analysis engine that deals with policy, and let's just take a bit of a look to see how that might work. So, really simply, okay, your attacker and your user looking at your suite of web applications. In this case, there are 3 of them. There may be 1,000. And your web applications are doing things such as they're spotting these user journeys, they're spotting this good behavior, this bad behavior. When this would be bad behavior, they're using those lovely blue arrows there to push it to this analysis engine, this App Sensor analysis engine, which again is nothing more complicated than saying it's a set of rules that sort of say, if I get a bit of that and a bit of that, not so sure. If the visitor happens to have a balaclava on and a gun and a ransom and a sort of threatening kind of hand over all the cash kind of note, that's definitely worth thinking about. Pushes all of this stuff up to the SOC on the right-hand side, who can go off and do good SOC things, or hopefully be get woken up at 3 o'clock on a Sunday morning in some faraway country if you've got MSSP. But also, the interesting thing is there with those orange lines kind of coming back in, your applications are getting a bit of feedback saying this user is bad, or this IP address, or this session, or this whatever intelligence you've got, and they can make some reactions and do some dynamic behavior based on what that is. It also means that if the attacker's had a bit of a probe up here and a bit of a probe there and a bit of a probe here, but not really quite managed to do enough attack on one thing, it means that your application can already be primed to know that actually there's a bit of reconnaissance kind of going on here. So there's a lot more there. The model is, in practice, could be a lot more complicated. You could start adding firewalls, also feeding into your analysis engine, etc. You could implement your analysis engine in use cases in your SOC, perhaps. Many possibilities, but that's how App Sensor did it. And what I would suggest is they've done a lot of the thinking for you. You know, stand on their shoulders and move on from there. But it does mean, though, that all those alerts going up to the SOC are high fidelity. They are worth them paying attention to. They are worth getting human eyes on to go, yes, that is valid or that is not valid. So that is a very important thing, and that also helps to lower your SOC's workload and allows them to do some very effective response if they need to do so. So, moving on. This is what I think is happening with App Sensor. It's tumbleweed for those of us that are not American. I don't think a lot's happening with it at the minute, which is really, really weird, because this idea came to me and I thought, oh my gosh, that's really cool. You're all stunned into silence. I'm just presuming you're also kind of thinking the same thing. That's quite interesting and quite a cool idea. not a lot is going on with it, and I'm not seeing a lot out there. So the application, the App Sensor application itself is, I don't believe it's production code. It fits in with things like ASAPI, which isn't really going anywhere. It's no WAS project. So maybe you can't just kind of pull it off the shelf and just use it, but actually what it does is not too complicated. So why is this? Is it a case of, we're getting the same kind of functionality from different devices or technologies on our networks? Is that how it is? I mean, we've got lots of, RASP and next-gen web application firewalls that are all claiming to have lots of behavioral analysis and ML, which I think is mostly stands for marketing language, but there's lots of that kind of going on. So what's going on? Is it cannibalization of that market? Is it the fact that you can just go, we built our application quick, we need to get it to market, we'll stick a web application firewall in front of it, which can be quite handy for getting through your PCI tests. There is a requirement suggesting you do secure code review on everything, or you put a WAF in front of it. So a WAF in front with one rule that never fires ticks the box, allegedly. So there's that idea. You could do that. You can use RASP, real-time application security protection. A variety of organizations, like some of the vendors downstairs, I think, are also selling these. And these are quite good. They instrument the runtime, and they kind of figure out what's normal and what's not, and can start shouting about it. Great technology. I'm not trying to rubbish them, but I'm saying actually that's a different sort of thing that can kind of fit in there as well. But you're still looking there at an external product that does not know much about your application. You've got these things here. You're saying, well, they're quick to deploy. We know that because you just buy one. That's great. They're known technology. We already know what these things are. That's great. You don't necessarily need a fairly mature life cycle, your developers to be really aware in order to be able to deploy this, and it may be good enough. Yeah? So maybe that's why it's coming along. Compare and contrast that then with your attack-aware applications. I would say you get much deeper insight into what the threats around your application are, because you're thinking about it from the beginning, you're building it in. But it's relatively unknown, which is why I'm talking to you here, saying, I think this is a cool idea, let's move on. It does take time to implement. There is a cost to that. I think it takes less time than you might think. But let's talk about that. But there is something, with all of these kind of aside, there is something I think that you can do with it today that's really important. And that is this thing, which is to say, you can use it as aspirational for your development teams. If you tell them that actually you can get one over on those nasty pen testers that kind of come along you, and you get a chance to be able to go to them and say, look, I've created something that you really can't break into. Doesn't that kind of sort of say, this is putting the boot on the other foot for a while, rather than the pen testers coming on and say, here's a big long list of stuff that you got wrong, even though you spent X man years making this thing. Absolutely. And that message, for some teams, works really well. The act of doing it, or act of implementing this, really starts to consolidate the thinking about security early on. I would argue it actually acts like a kind of a fairly fine-grained threat model, because you're having this kind of security conversation quite early on. You're actually putting this back into your application, and that's quite valuable. So you're thinking about it early on, you're building it in, that's great. And you can bring in other things. Fraud detection is another kind of element that's quite similar. Fraud and security often sit hand in hand, especially in, for instance, financial institutions. But actually bringing that thinking in to say, I don't trust this customer, I'm not quite sure about it. Where, again, extra validation if they want to transfer £1 million offshore. Well, absolutely. But being able to do this can really start to give you that momentum to start moving things forward. So I'll usually sort of put this to your development team and say, think about those pen testers that always manage to give you that great big report. Yes, 22-year-old comes in and looks at the 5 man years worth of work you put into this thing, and then 3 days later they come up with this massive report of woe, half of which you don't even understand. It is unfortunately part of what it is. You think, actually, if you've got that kind of relationship, start to work with that and say, well, think about how can you get one over on those pen testers? play with their minds. Think about all the things that you could do that would really, really make their lives hard when they're trying to poke around, check which doors are open, which ones are closed. Oh, it's open. Oh, no, it's closed. Those sorts of ideas. So then everything is not quite the same because you have detected them quietly, and you're now starting to basically use all of your evil wiles in order to do something with it. So it means that they're still looking, your pen tester is looking at this as a black box, then they're also finding it much, much harder to get to grips with. I work with pen testers, and I know that this is true. Absolutely true. They get self-doubt after about 2 days. You want to say a 3 or 4 day test. After 2 days, they're asking their colleagues, I can't find anything on this report. What do you think it could be? And they really, because they're motivated to find stuff. And actually, it's clearly the wrong thing, because actually isn't the happiest thing in the world to see a pen test report that's got no vulnerabilities in because the development team and the organization have done it right? I think that's awesome. But that's kind of where it kind of comes from. So I'm going to start closing down with a few bits and pieces. Some advice that I would give, having looked at this, not having implemented it at scale. I have kicked off some projects to start doing this. I don't have any results to share with you, but have a think about the app sensor detection points. They've already done the thinking on this. It's all open source. You can pull that down nice and easily. About 50 different things that you can look at and you can report. If you standardize it and anything comes along in the future, that's where it's likely to go. As you say, stand on the shoulders of those guys. They've already done a lot of good thinking. Start there. I'm hoping there may be more in this space, but also don't feel that you have to implement the whole thing. Start with just a couple of detection points and move on from there. It's the classic perfection being the enemy of the good. Don't do that. So I've got kind of a closing idea just to throw into this before we go into questions, which is, so MWR is a sort of research-led organization, and I came across something which is kind of a bit sort of left field, and I thought, there's something here that I think fits in with this whole attack-aware application thing quite well, and it's the idea of active defense. So, okay, let's take active defense. The sort of the far side of that is hacking back, which is don't do it, not legal. Not yet, okay? There have been moves in both the US and the UK in order to start removing some of the legal implications of actually conducting active defense against attackers. The UK National Cybersecurity Strategy, 2016 to 2021, and in the States, the Active Defense Certainty Bill, and there have been other moves as well. There's a lot more. It looks to us, but we don't know where it's going to go, that there is more writing on the wall that we may be able to take a more active stance against attackers. That might be just doing things like, okay, we're pretty sure we're being attacked, we can go and profile their site, we can go port scan it or something. That might be a thing. But your application is in a great place to do some of this sort of stuff. However, not quite yet, so keep your eye on the kind of the ball and see where it's going to go. That might be where it goes, but that seems like, to me, like it might kind of fit in with this quite interestingly. So that's what I'm going to say today. I'll be happy to take any questions.
Hi. This kind of thinking, to me, and I don't mean to spoil my own presentation tomorrow, shouldn't seem revolutionary, but it is. What kind of response are you getting from your customers or potential customers when you put these kind of ideas forward?
Okay, so I obviously engage with a lot of people who are in very naive terms. They're either kind of back in the sort of Stone Ages doing the quote waterfall type development, very, very prescriptive, or they are somewhere typically kind of transitional. I try to move them along. Rarely get to engage with anybody in doing DevSecOps. Typically, you end up with a lot of silos. Security happens somewhere else, so you get the external things. So actually building it in, you kind of need the developers to be on board with that message. So you need a certain amount of maturity. So any organization that's basically stuck back in the last century is not really going to be able to do that. The big pushback is, oh, it's going to take us a lot of time. And I'm getting some projects done internally at MWR, and what we're looking at is actually quite a lot of this stuff is not as complicated as you might think, because a lot of the detection points are stuff like, this is basically bad input, that's being thrown at us. This is clearly an XSS string, right? Okay, straight away we can just fire an alert at that. This is clearly these things. A lot of that goes into whatever standard libraries or routines that you've got for sanitizing input. So straight away, you can actually instrument that dead quick and get yourselves straight up to a point of at least picking up the, dare I say it, the low-hanging fruit from that sort of side of things. So it tends to come down to, that's a nice idea, but I'm more interested in getting this product to market tomorrow, so I now have 200 pen test findings to remediate. So I absolutely agree with you. The idea is not revolutionary, which is why we're sort of spotting this kind of starting in about 2010, but it's just not going anywhere. And whilst I asked the question in the title of my talk, what has happened to these attack-aware applications, I was kind of hoping that you guys are going to go, oh, Matt, you know what? There's this and there's that and the other thing. I'll go, okay, I feel very humble now, but now I know. So if anybody does know, please feel free to throw the rotten tomatoes at me now, or at least put me in my place.
Hi, same question. Again, hi, I'm Nick Drage. I'm presenting last tomorrow. I'm trying not to turn this into a self-promotion exercise. But I completely agree with you. There's nothing out there until you really look for it.
Yeah.
And then there's a lot. It's a case of get out there and find it. And I shall be the first person running up to the stage to talk to you while everybody else goes to have lunch.
Fantastic. I am looking forward to that. As well, it's clearly obvious. I am really keen to talk to anybody that's got thoughts in this space, or they do anything like this, or there are products out there, or they think that this might be a good approach. Come talk. I want to push this forward. I want to do something with it, because I think it's one of the most exciting ideas in this sphere. There's another angle which I didn't really touch on as well, which is if you're thinking about the way that things report up to the SOC. If you're getting these lovely high-fidelity alerts and you can standardize them in some way, that might be also quite effective for when you're trying to onboard lots and lots of different applications. That doesn't happen in the App Sensor project, and as far as I'm aware, there's no sort of standardization for that, but that's just another take on it. Okay, anybody else? Please, chap at the front here.
Yeah, there is something called zero trust model. There is something called zero trust model. So where they do attack-aware application on the IDAM solution. IDAM solution is the one which is where the authentication of users coming from different areas coming. So. Is it a good to push it to the attack-aware application on the IDAM, or on the attack-aware on the application itself?
Okay, so pushing it into IDAM, well, absolutely. I'd say authentication and knowing your user is clearly quite a critical function.
That's where you have all the history of a user authenticating, right? So it has not only one application, even multiple applications. An attacker is trying to not only hit one application. Rather, is going to do the probing of entire network, probing of entire application, whichever is the application is weaker. So he's going to do an attack on an application which is not even attack-aware application.
Yeah. So the IDAM is an important part of your bigger solution. You have a set of applications. You have another set of applications which can each respond and go, oh, I'm not thinking this is great. I'm spotting some user behavior that can then be fed back into your IDAM solution. The problem you've got is that IDAM is typically, but not always, consumed as a service from an external product, and the products and the services are not yet sort of aware of being able to take sort of a lot of feedback in to say, actually, I'm now suspicious about this user. So, yes, it's part of the big solution, but I don't think they're quite mature enough yet to be able to do that.
Okay, how easy is it to integrate this App Sense, whatever, into any application? Like, what are the different type of application? Mobile application, web application. How easy is it?
How easy is it to integrate? It depends how your application's been designed. It's how long is a piece of string in some respects. And I know they manufacture string in continuous lengths nowadays. So that's a bit of a problem. It depends how your application is structured. If you have things that are consistent, such as libraries for using things, saying doing authentication, for doing input validation, output encoding, lots of things like that, you can actually, there's some places here you go, these are really, really good places just to integrate a quick check. So you can start to get some of that relatively quickly. In terms of doing the whole thing, you know, kind of going, say, actually, we're going to look at it and we're going to be as sophisticated as we possibly can. Well, you're never going to quite get there. You're always going to be finding more and more interesting ways to do it that get more and more sophisticated and harder to spot. So it's it's going to be a big curve, a bit like that. I think getting up there as soon as you can is, I think, is a great thing to do. Getting that sort of top, you know, getting right to the top. You're never going to quite, you know, get to 100%, but you're always going to be trying there as you kind of go, oh, I've got some more sophisticated ideas as to how to detect some of the really top-tier attackers in here, and you're always going to be adding in more checks, and you kind of, and as you start to do that, they're just going to take longer to implement. So,
thank you very much, Matt.
thank you, everyone.
So lunch is served.